September 1945, 11:20 a.m. A prisoner transport train somewhere in Lincolnshire. The boxcar door slides open. Light floods in. Pale English autumn light that makes the women blink and shield their faces. 32 German women, still wearing the soiled remnants of vermached auxiliary uniforms, steel themselves for what comes next. Gera Hoffman, 23 years old, communications clerk from the 7th Panza division, feels her stomach tighten. She's heard the stories. Every woman in this car has heard the stories. What conquering armies do to the women they capture. What the Russians did in Slesia. What they all believe the British would do here. A British sergeant appears in the doorway. Middle-aged, tired eyes. He doesn't smile, but he doesn't leer either. He speaks in accented German, each word carefully pronounced. You will disembark. You will form 2 lines. The medical officer will examine you. You will be fed. No one will harm you. Then he does something that stops Gerda's breath. He steps back, gives them space. Waits. The first woman climbs down, then another. The sergeant maintains his distance, 3 feet, maybe 4. When one woman stumbles on the step, he extends his hand. She flinches. He doesn't move closer, just holds his hand there, steady until she finds her footing on her own. At the processing station, a British nurse hands Gerda a tin mug of tea. Not thrown, not demanded in exchange for something, handed with a nod. Gerda stares at the mug. The tea is hot. Real sugar sits at the bottom. She will keep that mug for 47 years. Strength, it turned out, wasn't what they'd been taught. Strength was knowing when not to use power at all. If this challenges what you thought you knew about war, about enemies, about what separates civilization from chaos, you'll want to see where this goes. Hit subscribe. This story gets deeper. For 2 years, every woman wearing a vermached auxiliary uniform had heard the warnings repeated in barracks, whispered in mesh halls, typed in official bulletins from Berlin. British soldiers were animals worse than animals. They would violate captured German women systematically as punishment, as entertainment, as policy. The propaganda wasn't subtle. Leaflets showed cartoons of leering British soldiers dragging German women into alleyways. Radio broadcasts described fabricated atrocities in France and Belgium. Training officers for female auxiliaries devoted entire sessions to what would happen if captured. Better to take your own life, one instructor told a room of radio operators in April 1945, than fall into British hands alive. Some women sewed razor blades into their uniform linings. Others carried cyanide capsules issued by sympathetic officers. Most simply lived with the cold, constant fear that capture meant something worse than death. The fear wasn't irrational propaganda alone. The Eastern Front had created its own horror stories, true ones. German women fleeing westward brought accounts of Soviet conduct that gave Nazi lies about Western allies a terrible plausibility. If the Russians did those things, why wouldn't the British? By war's end, approximately 14,000 German women served in various Wehrmacht auxiliary roles, communications, logistics, medical support, administrative functions. As Germany collapsed, many were captured alongside regular military personnel. They expected brutality. They prepared for violation. They steeled themselves for the propaganda to prove true. They were wrong. The medical exam came first. Gerda stood in line with 11 other women outside a converted barn on the British camp's perimeter. Each woman received a number on a paper tag. Each was told to wait. The examining physician was a captain, gay-haired, spectacles, wedding ring visible on his left hand. A female British nurse stood beside him, always present during examinations, Gerda would learn. Protocol mandatory. When Gerda's turn came, the doctor spoke in German again. The same careful pronunciation, the same matter-of-fact tone. I will check for injuries, malnutrition, disease. The nurse remains present throughout. You may decline any examination. Do you understand? Gera nodded. She understood the words. She didn't understand the question. Decline. The exam was brief, professional, thorough. The doctor noted a healing wound on her shoulder. Shrapnel from an artillery strike 3 weeks prior. He cleaned it with iodine, applied fresh bandaging, made a note on his clipboard. You'll need that checked again in 4 days. Report to sick call. He didn't touch her except where medical necessity required. The nurse stood 3 feet away the entire time, visible in Gerda's peripheral vision. A silent guarantee. When Gerda returned to the barracks, a converted agricultural storage building with bunk beds, clean straw mattresses, and a coal stove. She found the tin mug of tea waiting on her assigned bed. Not a mistake. Not a test, just tea. She lifted the mug, smelled it. The sugar had dissolved, leaving faint sweetness. British Army issue. Standard ration. Nothing special. Everything unprecedented. She drank it slowly, standing by the window, watching British soldiers walk past outside. They were laughing about something. A football match, maybe. They didn't even glance at the barracks. That night, Gera slept 8 hours without waking. The first uninterrupted sleep she'd had in 7 months. What Gera and the other women didn't know, couldn't have known, was that their treatment wasn't accident or individual kindness. It was policy system doctrine. Britain's approach to prisoners of war, including female PS, derived from multiple overlapping frameworks. Geneva Convention compliance. Britain was signatory to the 1929 Convention, which established treatment standards for PS. Article 3 required humane treatment without adverse distinction. Article 14 specifically addressed women prisoners, mandating treatment with all consideration due to their sex. War Office directives. Multiple circulars issued between 1943 and 1945 established specific protocols for female P treatment. These included mandatory female medical staff presence during examinations, separate housing facilities, and explicit prohibition of any conduct that could constitute abuse or exploitation. Intelligence value. Female auxiliaries possess potentially valuable information about communications networks, logistics chains, and administrative systems. Humane treatment maximized cooperation during interrogation. Brutality destroyed intelligence value. Reciprocity calculations. British personnel remained in German captivity throughout the war. Any systematic mistreatment of German prisoners risked retaliation against British PS. Restraint protected British lives elsewhere. Institutional culture. The British military maintained a regimental system that emphasized discipline, honor, and conduct standards. Violation of P treatment protocols was a court-martial offense treated with institutional seriousness. The evidence of implementation was documented in multiple ways. Red Cross inspection reports from late 1945 noted that female German PS in British custody received adequate food rations, approximately 2,100 calories daily, supplemented with vitamin provisions. Medical care was provided by qualified personnel. Living conditions met or exceeded Geneva standards. Mortality rates among female PS in British custody remained below 2%, primarily from pre-existing medical conditions or injuries sustained before capture. No deaths from maltreatment, starvation, or violence were recorded. Disciplinary records show British military police investigated 47 allegations of misconduct toward female PS between May and December 1945. 23 resulted in court-martial proceedings. Convictions carried sentences ranging from reduction in rank to dishonorable discharge and imprisonment. This wasn't mercy. It was order. The barbed wire and guard towers were punishment enough. Everything beyond that followed rules. Rules enforced by officers who understood that civilization doesn't collapse just because you're winning. Processing took 3 days. Each woman was interviewed by a British intelligence officer through a German-speaking interpreter, usually Austrian refugees who'd fled to Britain before the war. Questions were factual. Name, rank, unit, duties, location served. Nothing invasive, nothing humiliating. Personal belongings were catalogued and stored. Wedding rings, photographs, letters, anything not military equipment was tagged and placed in individual boxes. The women were told they could retrieve items during designated hours. One woman, Anna Becca, had carried her mother's rosary through 2 years of service. A British corporal logged it, placed it in an envelope with her name written in neat block letters, and handed it back to her immediately. Religious items, he explained in German, you keep those. Uniforms were exchanged for civilian clothing. Donated items from British relief organizations. Nothing matched. Nothing fit perfectly, but everything was clean, mended, serviceable. Gera received a wool skirt, a cotton blouse, thick stockings, and a cardigan with patched elbows. The cardigan became her favorite possession. Barracks assignments followed. 2 long rooms, 16 bunks each, coal stove in the center, washing facilities at the end of the building. Posted rules in German on the wall. Wake time, meal times, work assignments, lights out, sick call procedures. The first communal meal came on the evening of the second day. Barley soup, dark bread, margarine, boiled potatoes, tea with milk and sugar. No one spoke. The women ate slowly, some savoring every bite, some crying quietly into their bowls, some just staring at food that appeared on schedule without threat or trade. Gera watched a British soldier, couldn't have been more than 19, ladling soup with mechanical efficiency. He didn't make eye contact, didn't smile or sneer, just filled bowls, moved down the line, filled more bowls. When one woman's hand shook and she spilled soup on the serving table, he simply wiped it clean and refilled her bowl without comment. It was the absence of cruelty that stunned them. Not kindness exactly, just the absence of everything they'd feared. By the fourth day, work assignments began. The British operated multiple labor programs for PS, male and female, focused primarily on agricultural support. Britain's wartime food production had strained available labor. PS filled critical gaps for the women. Assignments included farm labor, forestry support, and light manufacturing. Hours were regulated, 8 hours daily, 6 days per week with Sunday rest. Work was compensated with small wages paid in camp script, redeemable at a canteen for supplemental items, toiletries, writing paper, cigarettes, chocolate. Gera's group was assigned to a dairy farm 3 miles from the camp. Every morning a truck collected them at 7 a.m. A single British soldier escorted them. Corporal Davies, a Welshman with a pronounced limp from a wound at Normandy. Davies spoke perhaps 20 words of German. Work, break, lunch, home. His communication relied primarily on gestures and example. The farm belonged to a widow, Mrs. Margaret Foster, whose sons were both serving overseas. She needed help with milking, making, feeding, basic maintenance. She didn't need prisoners. She'd specifically requested them over displaced persons because, as she told the labor office, they need the work, and I need the hands. The first morning, Mrs. Foster demonstrated milking technique to women who'd never touched a cow. She didn't hover, didn't criticize, corrected mistakes with patience. Steady hands, she'd say. Cow doesn't know there's a war on. By the second week, the women worked without supervision. Mrs. Foster left tea and biscuits in the barn at mid-morning break. She never mentioned it, just refilled the thermos daily. The work was hard, honest physical labor that left hands calloused and backs aching, but it was fair labor with fair treatment. And at the end of each day, Corporal Davies drove them back to camp without incident. One afternoon in October, Gera stayed late to help Mrs. Foster repair a fence damaged by a storm. Davies waited by the truck smoking, reading a letter from home. When Gera finished, Mrs. Foster pressed a paper bag into her hands. "Eggs," she said, "for your mates." 6 eggs, a fortune in 1945, given freely. Gera carried them back to the barracks like they were made of crystal. That night the women boiled them carefully and divided them into precise portions. Each woman received half an egg. It was the first gift any of them had received from the enemy. The relationship between German PS and British civilians evolved through stages. Suspicion, tolerance, grudging, acceptance, and eventually something approaching normally. Most British civilians had lost someone in the war. Sons, brothers, husbands, fathers. The presence of German prisoners complicated grief with proximity. Some civilians openly opposed P-labor programs. Others accepted them as practical necessity while maintaining cold distance. A few, like Mrs. Foster, chose active humanity. By November, Mrs. Foster invited the women into her kitchen for lunch rather than eating in the barn, soup and bread around her table with proper bowls and spoons. She didn't make conversation beyond practical matters, weather, cow health, fence repairs, but she set places for them like they were workers, not prisoners. On a Sunday in early December, she asked if any of them wanted to attend church service in the village. Attendance was voluntary. 2 women, both Catholic, accepted. Corporal Davies escorted them to the small stone church and sat in the back pew. The women sat near the middle. The congregation stared. The vicar's sermon mentioned nothing about forgiveness or enemies, just the regular liturgy, familiar hymns, communion offered to all present. After the service, one elderly British woman approached Gera in the churchyard. "My son died at Arnhem," she said quietly. "I thought I'd hate you, but you're just a girl." She didn't offer friendship, didn't absolve anything, just stated fact, and walked away. Gera stood in that churchyard for 10 minutes after everyone left, trying to reconcile the woman's face. Grief etched deep, but no malice with everything she'd been taught about British hatred. The camp maintained a small infirmary staffed by a British medical officer, 2 nurses, and a German P doctor who'd been captured in North Africa. Treatment was provided without distinction between British personnel and prisoners. Same medical standards, same protocols, same pharmaceutical supplies. In late November, a woman named Clara Steiner developed severe pneumonia. The British medical officer, Captain Reynolds, transferred her immediately to a civilian hospital in Lincoln. She remained there for 11 days, receiving the same sulfur drugs and care as British patients. The hospital records listed her as P patient without additional designation. When she returned to camp, weak but recovering, she described her experience to the other women. The nurses called me by name, not prisoner or German my name. They brought me extra blankets when I shivered. One sat with me when I was frightened. Captain Reynolds visited the barracks weekly for basic health checks. He established a system where women could report medical concerns confidentially through the German doctor, ensuring privacy for sensitive issues. The contrast with wartime medical care was stark. In vermached service, auxiliary women received minimal medical attention. Supplies were scarce. Care was rushed. Complaints were often ignored. Here, a British captain spent 15 minutes examining a rash on a prisoner's arm to ensure it wasn't spreading infection. Medicine, Captain Reynolds once told his nurses within earshot of several PS, doesn't have nationality. Disease doesn't care who wins wars. Neither do I. December brought cold that seeped through barracks walls despite the coal stove burning constantly. The women received additional blankets, British Army surplus, rough wool, warm. On December 23rd, Corporal Davis informed them there would be no work assignments for 3 days. Christmas holiday. The women would remain in camp with standard rations. December 25th arrived gray and damp. The women woke to find the Masole decorated with paper chains crafted by British soldiers stationed at the camp, hung the night before. A small pine tree stood in the corner, undecorated but present. Breakfast included porridge, bread with real butter and tea, normal portions. Then mid-morning something extraordinary happened. A British chaplain arrived with a portable organ. He announced in slow German that a Christmas service would be held at noon for anyone who wished to attend. Attendance was voluntary. All 32 women came. The chaplain conducted a simple service, scripture readings, familiar carols, a brief meditation on peace. He didn't preach at them, didn't mention war or sides or enemies, just offered the Christmas story in German and English, alternating verses. When he reached Silent Night, the women sang in German. The British soldiers stationed around the perimeter, guards technically, sang in English. Different words, same melody, same moment. Several women wept, not from sadness exactly, from the strangeness of singing Christmas hymns with the men who defeated them, from recognizing a shared faith that neither propaganda nor war had managed to destroy. After the service, the chaplain distributed small care packages donated by British relief organizations. Each contained a bar of soap, writing paper, a pencil, and a chocolate bar. "Merry Christmas," he said to each woman in German. "God sees no barbed wire." Dinner that evening included roasted chicken, remarkably, impossibly, with potatoes, carrots, and gravy. Real gravy. Dessert was tinned fruit and custard. The British soldiers ate the same meal in their own mess. Christmas rations distributed equally. Gerda ate slowly, committing every bite to memory. Later, she would tell her daughter that Christmas 1945 was the day she understood that cruelty was a choice, not an inevitability. The British chose differently. In January 1946, the women were permitted to write letters to family in Germany. Each letter was censored, read by British intelligence officers to ensure no sensitive information was transmitted. Each was limited to 1 page. The censorship was explained clearly. Letters containing military information would be destroyed. Letters containing personal news would be forwarded through Red Cross channels to last known addresses in Germany. Gerda wrote to her mother in Vermont, "I am alive. I am safe. I work on a farm with kind people. The British treat us fairly. Please do not worry. I will come home when they allow it. Tell father I am well." She wanted to write more, wanted to describe the tin mug, the Christmas service, Mrs. Foster's eggs, but the words felt too large for the page, too strange to commit to paper. Letters were written that first month. 47 were approved and forwarded. The letters that reached Germany carried a message far more powerful than their simple words. German women in British captivity were writing home. They were alive. They were unharmed. Nazi propaganda had insisted captured women would disappear into brutality. These letters proved otherwise. By March, some women began receiving replies, letters from mothers, sisters, occasionally fathers or brothers who'd returned from P camps themselves. The replies were cautious, often disbelieving. One woman shared her sister's letter with the barracks. You say they treat you well. How can this be true? Why would the enemy show mercy? The question hung in the cold March air. No one had an answer that made sense within the framework they'd been taught. Here's where the transformation becomes undeniable. The fear doesn't just fade, it inverts completely. If you're starting to question everything you thought you knew about warfare, restraint, and what actually defines strength, you need to stay with this. Subscribe. This goes deeper still. By spring 1946, camp protocols evolved. The most heavily guarded women, those from signals intelligence or administrative roles with access to sensitive information, completed interrogation cycles. Security classifications dropped. Movement restrictions eased. Escorted work details became unescorted for women with clean disciplinary records. Gerder's group began walking to Mrs. Foster's farm without Corporal Davies. He'd meet them at the end of the day for transport back, but the workday itself ran unsupervised. Mrs. Foster began paying them directly, small wages in actual British currency, not camp script. She paid the rate she'd pay any farmhand. When one woman questioned this, Mrs. Foster shrugged. Fair work deserves fair wage. War's over. Or hadn't you heard? The war had ended officially in May 1945, but Mrs. Ba-Fry Foster was the first person to treat it like settled fact, rather than ongoing reality. Other farmers followed her example. By April 1946, German P women worked across Lincolnshire with minimal supervision. Dairy farms, vegetable gardens, forestry crews, textile factories converting back to civilian production. The women responded to trust with reliability. Attendance rates exceeded 98%. No escape attempts were recorded among female PS in the Lincolnshire region. Escape apparently required wanting to leave. One afternoon in May, Mrs. Foster's tractor broke down midfield. Gerder, who developed mechanical aptitude during Wehrmacht service, diagnosed a fuel line blockage and repaired it using farm tools and improvisation. Mrs. Foster watched from the fence line, arms crossed. You could have walked away while I went for help, she said when Gerder finished. Gerder wiped grease from her hands. Where would I walk to? Mrs. Foster smiled. The first smile Gerder had ever seen from her. Exactly. That evening, Mrs. Foster invited the entire work crew into her house for dinner. Proper dinner, at her dining table with china plates and cloth napkins. She served shepherd's pie, bread, butter, tea. They ate like civilized people because that's what they were. Trust creates space for thought. Gerda spent evening hours in the barracks, lying on her bunk staring at the ceiling, processing the dissonance between expectation and experience. Everything she'd been taught insisted the British were barbarous, racial inferiors, degenerate, weak, cruel when given power. But the evidence accumulated daily in contradiction. The medical officer who treated her shoulder wound with the same care he'd treat a British patient. Mrs. Foster, who paid fair wages and served dinner on china plates. The chaplain who offered Christmas service without condition. Corporal Davies, who escorted them safely every day asking nothing. The British soldiers who walked past the barracks without leering, touching, threatening. The system that investigated misconduct seriously and punished violations. If the propaganda about British brutality was false and direct experience proved it was, what else was false? The question opened doors Gerder had kept locked throughout the war. She began asking herself questions she'd never permitted before. If the British aren't inferior, what about the French, the Americans? If restraint is possible for victors, why didn't Germany show restraint? If PS deserve humane treatment, what happened in German camps? She didn't discuss these thoughts with others initially, but in June during an evening meal, another woman, Margaret, former logistics clear, spoke quietly to the group. I've been thinking, if they lied about this, what else did they lie about? The barracks went silent. Then slowly others began sharing similar thoughts. The forbidden questions spoken aloud. They didn't reach conclusions, didn't process everything. But the questions themselves marked transformation, the beginning of critical thought after years of enforced certainty. One woman summed it up simply. We expected monsters and found men. That's the problem with lies. Eventually reality contradicts them. Repatriation began officially in late 1946. British authorities announced that PSWs would return to Germany in organized transports as resources and receiving capacity allowed. Female PS considered lower security priority than male military personnel would return in early waves. Gerder's group received repatriation notices in September 1946. They would depart for Germany in October. transported to Bremen, processed through Allied administration, released to return to family. Most women felt relief mixed with apprehension. Home meant reuniting with family, rebuilding lives. But Germany in 1946 was devastated. Cities in ruins, food scarce, infrastructure destroyed, political future uncertain. Britain, paradoxically, had become stable, familiar, safe. When British authorities announced an option to remain temporarily as voluntary workers, no longer PWs but contract laborers with proper wages and worker protections, 11 women from Gera's barracks applied. Mrs. Foster specifically requested that Gera remain as far. She offered room in the farmhouse, regular wages, 1 day off weekly, and contract terms renewable quarterly. Gera accepted. "My mother will understand," she wrote in her next letter home. "I'll come back when Germany is ready to receive me." She stayed 14 months, worked Mrs. Foster's farm through harvest seasons, winter repairs, spring planting, sent money home, real wages converted to occupation currency and transferred through official channels. Other women made similar choices. By January 1947, approximately 200 German women remained in Britain as voluntary workers, some in agriculture, others in textile factories, hospitals, or domestic service. They weren't prisoners anymore. They were workers. The distinction mattered. Most women eventually returned to Germany. Gera went home in December 1947. She found Bremen partially rebuilt. Her family intact but struggling. She used savings from British wages to help her parents purchase a small shop. She married in 1950, had 3 children, lived a quiet life, but she never forgot the tin mug. She kept it on her kitchen shelf until she died in 1992. When her daughter asked about it, this battered British Army tin mug among proper German teacups, Gera told her the story. "That mug was the first thing a British soldier gave me. Not demanded, not traded, just given. It was the moment I understood that strength doesn't require cruelty." A few women never returned. 3 married British men. Relationships that began as friendships during work assignments developed over months of proximity, resulted in proper courtships and marriages approved by both families. These weren't war bride romances from propaganda films. They were quiet unions between people who'd found common ground in shared work and gradual trust. The marriages lasted by all accounts. No drama, no scandal, just life continuing past war's end. Others maintained correspondence. Letters exchanged between former PS and British civilians. Mrs. Foster and Gera wrote each other until Mrs. Foster's death in 1971. Postcards at Christmas. Updates on children and grandchildren. A relationship that began in a barn with a thermos of tea sustained across decades by mutual respect. These threads, individual lives intersecting, remaining connected, represent the human-scale legacy of institutional restraint. Policy created possibility. Individuals transformed possibility into relationship. The story of German women encountering British restraint isn't fundamentally about mercy. It's about civilization. Civilization is infrastructure, policies, protocols, accountability, systems that constrain power even when power faces no external constraints. It's the officer who investigates misconduct even when the victim is an enemy. It's the rule that requires a nurse present during medical exams. It's the soldier who maintains distance not because he's forced to, but because the system created that standard, and he believes in the system. The barbed wire was real. The guard towers were staffed. The power imbalance was absolute. What separated British P camps from other systems wasn't the absence of power. It was the intentional, systematic, institutionally enforced choice not to abuse it. The women who expected brutality and received tea, they became living proof that victory doesn't require vengeance, that enemies can become former enemies without intermediate stages of cruelty, that the strongest nations are those that maintain standards even when no one can punish their violation. Gera's tin mug represented this principle in miniature, a small kindness given freely, carrying weight far beyond its material value. She used to tell her grandchildren, the mug itself was nothing special. Standard British Army issue, probably cost pennies. But what it represented, that moment when someone with all the power chose not to use it harmfully, that changed everything. The cumulative effect of thousands of such moments transformed women who'd expected monsters into women who understood that humanity persists through systems maintained by individuals who believe rules matter, even when enforcement is optional. Before you go, one final thought. This story is part of a series examining what restraint actually costs, what it actually achieves, and why it matters more than victory alone. If that perspective matters to you, subscribe. The history that challenges assumptions is the history worth remembering. The tin mug sat on Gerda's kitchen shelf for 45 years, battered and dented, holding no tea, but it held.